A Deathworld girl's 120 decibel scream broke the station AI's language core. All translations halted. The metal grate slammed shut behind me with a sound like a closing tomb, and I knew right then that hiding in a cargo crawlspace had been the worst decision of my entire life. My name is Hannah Brooks. I am 19 years old, and at that exact moment I was wedged between two coolant pipes on a trade station 3 jumps from Earth, with no permit, no return ticket, and a left foot that had gone completely numb 40 minutes ago. The ship I had stowed away on was called the Falling Leaf, a research vessel run by a kind old professor who had not noticed me slipping into the back of his cargo hold while he argued with a customs drone about plant samples. I had thought I was so clever. I had packed sandwiches. I had brought a flashlight. I had told myself that once I reached Kelthari Trade Station 7, I would simply walk out, blend into the crowd, and find the famous Crystal Gardens before anyone realized I did not belong. That plan, I now understood, was something only a very tired and very desperate human girl could possibly believe in. The crawlspace smelled like burnt copper and sweet fruit, which I later learned was the natural scent of Velish skin oil, the species that ran most of the maintenance work on the station. I could hear them moving around outside the panel, their footsteps soft as falling snow. Everything about this place was quiet. The hum of the air system was a whisper. The doors slid open without a sound. Even the announcements over the speaker system sounded like someone reading a poem in a library. It was so different from Earth that my ears kept straining, looking for noise that simply was not there. I shifted my weight, trying to wake up my numb foot, and my elbow knocked against a loose pipe. The pipe rang like a bell. The footsteps outside stopped. I held my breath until my chest burned. I counted to 30 in my head. I counted to 60. Then the panel above me slid open, and a long, pale, glass-smooth face peered down at me with 2 wide silver eyes. The Velish maintenance worker did not shout. He did not call for help. He simply tilted his head, blinked very slowly, and made a soft chiming sound that my translator earpiece, a little bean-shaped device tucked behind my left ear, turned into gentle words. "Little visitor," the words said, "you are not supposed to be in there. Please come out before you damage something important." I came out. I came out scraped and sore and smelling like coolant, and I stood in front of him with my hands raised in the universal sign of surrender. He was almost 3 meters tall, thin as a young tree, and his bones, I could see through the soft fabric of his uniform, looked like they were made of something thinner than my own. He did not seem angry. He seemed worried, the way a parent looks when a child climbs onto a roof. He pressed a small button on his collar and spoke into it. More chimes. My translator turned them into a calm report to station security, location and species and condition of stowaway, all stated like he was filing a weather update. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived. They were Velish too, but bigger, with darker uniforms and small silver pins on their chests. They were polite. They were so polite it almost hurt. They asked me my name. They asked me my age. They asked me where I had come from, and when I told them Earth, the taller of the 2 made a tiny sound in his throat that my translator did not bother to convert. I figured it out anyway. It was the sound a person makes when they have been told something they were afraid of hearing. He led me through the station with a hand hovering near my elbow, never quite touching, as if he was afraid I might bruise him. The corridor was beautiful. The walls were made of a soft cream-colored material that seemed to glow from inside, and tall plants grew in pots at every corner, their leaves curling in slow patterns like underwater flowers. Other beings moved past us, and I tried not to stare. There were Threx merchants, short and round with 4 arms, their skin a deep blue. There were Goxians, who looked like walking stones with kind crystal eyes. There were Kta, tall and thin with feathers instead of hair, who paused mid-step when they saw me, and then walked on with what I could only describe as careful curiosity. Everyone was so quiet. I thought about my high school cafeteria. I thought about the noise of 200 teenagers eating tater tots and shouting about a basketball game. I thought about my grandmother yelling from the back porch that dinner was ready. I thought about thunder, real thunder, the kind that rolls across an Iowa cornfield in August and shakes the windows in their frames. None of those things existed here. The loudest sound in this corridor was the soft tap of my own boots on the floor, and even that made the security officers wince a little every time my heel came down. We reached a small office and the officer asked me to sit. I sat. He told me, through the chime of his voice and the soft voice in my ear, that I would be processed for return to Earth within 48 hours. I would not be jailed. I would not be fined. I would simply be sent home like a child returned to a playground after wandering too far. I tried to argue. I told him about the Crystal Gardens. I told him about my scholarship. I told him I just wanted to see one new world before my money ran out and my visa expired and my life became another small office with a small window and a small chair. He listened. He really listened. And then he told me, very gently, that humans were not denied entry because anyone disliked us. Humans were denied entry because of what we were. We were Deathworlders. And Deathworlders, his quiet voice said, came from places where every breath was a fight, every meal was a struggle, and every voice had to carry across great distances. We were strong, he said. We were too strong for places like this. I almost laughed. I almost pointed at my 5'4" frame and my skinny arms, and my history of losing every arm wrestling match I had ever entered. Strong was the last word anyone back home would have used to describe me. But I did not laugh, because the officer was not joking. He looked at me the way you might look at a tiger in a zoo, with respect and with a fence between you, even though I was the one sitting on the wrong side of the desk. He left me in the office with a cup of warm liquid that tasted like honey mixed with grass. I drank it. I had not realized how thirsty I was. The door slid shut, but it did not lock, because of course it did not lock. Why would they lock a door against a creature who, in their minds, could probably tear the wall out by hand if she really wanted to? I sat there and I thought about my mother. I thought about how she would worry when she got the call from station authorities. I thought about how she would say, "Oh, Hannah, oh, sweet girl, what have you done now?" And I thought about how I would have to look her in the eye when I got home and admit that my big adventure had lasted exactly 6 hours. The cup was empty. The chair was hard. The lights overhead pulsed gently in a rhythm that felt designed to keep visitors calm. I stood up to stretch my legs, and that was when I heard it. A voice, a real voice, loud even by station standards, coming from somewhere down the hall, growing louder by the second. It was a Velish voice, but it was not the smooth chime I had been hearing all afternoon. It was high and sharp and full of an emotion my translator was struggling to name. The little bean in my ear flickered through 3 different words before it settled on the right one. The word it chose was fear. I went to the door. I pressed my ear against it, which was probably ridiculous because the door was thin enough that I could hear everything anyway. There was running. There were more voices joining the first, all of them rising in pitch, and then there was a deep, terrible groan from somewhere below us, the sound of metal under stress, the kind of sound that had no good ending. The floor under my feet shifted just slightly, just enough to make my stomach drop. Somewhere in the station, something very heavy had started to move in a way it was not supposed to move. I should have stayed in the office, I know that now. Every rule in my head told me to stay. The officer would come back. The station had emergency teams. I was a stowaway, a child, a Deathworlder who had already caused enough trouble for one day. But the voices kept rising and they kept getting more desperate, and the bean in my ear kept translating fragments that made my chest tighten. Help. Pinned. Cannot move. Please. I opened the door. The corridor was different now. It was full of beings. Velish workers, a few Threx, a Goxian engineer. All of them moving toward the source of the noise, but moving the way people move in a dream, slow and uncertain and stumbling. I followed them. Nobody stopped me. Nobody seemed to even notice the small human girl in the dirty jumpsuit slipping along the wall behind them. We turned a corner and another corner, and then we reached the edge of a wide cargo bay, and I saw what had happened. A gravity plate had failed. One of the big ones, the kind that held cargo containers in place during loading. Half of the bay floor had simply stopped working, and a stack of metal containers, each one the size of a small car, had slid sideways across the deck. At the bottom of the slide, half buried under one of the containers, was a Velish dockworker. His leg was trapped. I could see, even from across the bay, that his thin glass-like bone structure had cracked in places it should not have cracked. He was conscious. He was making sounds. The sounds were rising. They were rising fast. And the others, the ones who had run here to help him, were freezing in place. It started with the Threx merchant nearest to me. She took one step into the bay, and the dockworker let out a sharp wail, and her 4 arms locked up at her sides like someone had cut the strings of a puppet. Then the Goxian engineer behind her did the same thing, his crystal eyes going wide and still. Then a Velish supervisor, then a maintenance worker, then a security officer who had been running with his medical kit raised in one hand. One by one, every single being in that cargo bay went stiff and silent, their bodies trembling but unable to move forward. I did not understand. Not yet. I would learn later that this was a thing called startle paralysis, a survival reflex hardwired into almost every species in this part of the galaxy. On their homeworlds, sudden loud distress sounds had once meant a hunter was nearby, and the safest thing a body could do was lock down and stay still until the danger passed. It was a gift from their evolution, a tiny pause that had saved millions of their ancestors. But that pause was 12 full seconds long, and the Velish dockworker did not have 12 seconds. The container was still sliding. The sound of metal on metal was getting worse. He was about to be crushed under a load that no thin glass bone body was meant to survive. I stood at the edge of the bay, the only creature in the room not frozen, the only set of legs that still worked. I knew in the back of my head that this was the moment my old life ended. Whatever happened next, the small office and the polite return to Earth were no longer my future. I felt the change settle into my chest like a stone dropping into water. I took one breath. I took another. I looked at the dockworker, at his wide silver eyes, at the way he was looking back at me with the last of his hope, and I did the only thing a Deathworld girl could do. I ran. The cargo bay floor was cold under my boots, and the metal sang with every step I took, but I barely heard it because all I could hear was the high, thin sound of the Velish dockworker losing his grip on consciousness. His name, I would learn later, was Tessel. In that moment he had no name. He had only eyes, 2 wide silver pools fixed on me as I crossed the bay at a dead sprint, the only moving creature in a room full of statues. The frozen Threx merchant did not blink as I passed her. The Goxian engineer stood with 1 foot raised, locked mid-step like a photograph. I dodged around a frozen security officer whose medical kit hung in his stiff hand, and I reached Tessel just as the container above him shifted another finger-width sideways. The metal screamed. He did not. He had run out of air. I dropped to my knees beside him. The container was huge. It was a cube of dark blue alloy with handling marks scraped along its sides, and one of its lower corners was pressed directly against Tessel's right leg, just above what I would call a knee. His leg was not broken in the way human legs break. It was cracked, the way porcelain cracks, fine pale lines running along the surface of the skin from places where the bone underneath had given way. There was no blood, or at least not red blood like I knew. There was a clear silvery liquid leaking from the cracks, and where it pooled on the metal floor it caught the overhead lights and turned them into tiny rainbows. It was beautiful. It was terrible. I shoved the thought aside and put my shoulder against the container. I pushed. I was a 5'4", 19-year-old who had been picked second to last in gym class for 6 years running, and I was trying to move 400 kilos of cargo container off a man whose bones were made of something that broke if you sneezed at it. I planted my feet. I locked my knees. I pushed with everything I had and the container moved. Not much, maybe a centimeter. But it moved because the gravity plate under it was still partly broken, and because the container was sliding on a slick floor, and because earth muscles, the kind that grow up fighting against a full standard gravity every single day of their lives, are not the same kind of muscles the rest of the galaxy carries around. The container rocked. Tessel made a small sound. I pushed harder, and the container slid another centimeter, and I felt his leg come free under it just as my arm started to shake. But he was still bleeding silver. He was still slipping under, and I could see, now that I was close, that he was not going to last another minute without help. The medics were 10 meters away. They were standing in a perfect frozen line, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, every nerve in their bodies stuck in the long pause that their evolution had given them. 12 seconds, I thought wildly. The first wail had been 30 seconds ago. They should be unfreezing any moment. But the moment was not coming, because Tessel kept making little broken sounds with every breath, fresh distress signals that reset their nervous systems again and again, holding them in place like flies in amber. Something had to break the loop. I looked at the medics. I looked at the security officer. I looked at the door of the bay, beyond which I could hear more footsteps coming, more bodies running toward this trap. I thought about how every person who arrived here would simply join the line of frozen statues. I thought about how this poor man would slip away in front of an audience of helpers who could not move a single finger to save him. And I remembered something my grandmother used to say, on summer evenings when I would not come inside for dinner. She would step onto the back porch, plant her hands on her hips, fill her lungs to the bottom, and shout my name in a voice that could make squirrels fall out of trees in the next county over. Hannah Marie Brooks, she would yell, and I would come running because there was nothing on earth that could stand against a grandmother's voice when it was loud enough. I had her voice. I had her lungs. I had ancestors who had screamed across canyons and across rivers and across the roar of hurricanes. My voice was a tool. It had always been a tool. The galaxy had simply forgotten what tools like mine could do. I stood up, I tilted my head back. I sucked in air until my ribs ached, and I screamed. Not a yell, not a shout, a scream. The kind of scream a girl pulls from somewhere below her stomach, somewhere ancient, somewhere that remembers when our great-great-great-grandmothers stood at the mouths of caves and made noise loud enough to drive away anything that might want to come in. I screamed until my throat felt like fire. I screamed words. I screamed wake up. I screamed somebody help him. I screamed at the medics and the officers and the entire still and quiet station that had decided in some long-ago meeting that loudness was a thing to be feared. I screamed because it was the only weapon I had, and because Tessel was about to slip away, and because I was furious in a way I had never been furious before in my entire small, careful life. The station heard me. The lights flickered, not because of the gravity plate, because of me. I would learn later that my scream registered at 120.4 decibels in the bay's audio sensors, which was the loudest sound that bay had recorded since its construction 60 years earlier. The number alone meant nothing to me. What it meant to the station was something else entirely. The station was run by an artificial intelligence named Sivra, a Tier 3 linguistic mind whose job was to translate every spoken word from every species into every other species, in real time, across thousands of conversations at once. Sivra's auditory input system processed every sound in every public space as a potential piece of language. When my scream hit Sivra's microphones, Sivra tried to do its job. It tried to translate the sound into meaning. It failed. It tried again. It failed. It tried a third time, building a search loop that ate through its processing power at a terrible speed. By the time the loop reached its fourth pass, Sivra had used up 94% of its capacity trying to assign words to a sound that had no words. Its safety systems kicked in. They quarantined the language module. They flagged the input as a possible weapon and shut down every translation device within 200 meters of the bay, because something that loud and that meaningless could only be, in Sivra's careful logic, a hostile act. In my ear, the bean went silent. The soft little voice that had been guiding me all day simply stopped. I did not notice, I was still screaming. But the medics noticed. Or rather, they noticed the silence after my scream, the sudden cutoff when my lungs finally ran out of air. The high frequency of Tessel's distress sounds was still there, but now it was wrapped inside the echo of something so much louder that their nervous systems could not classify it as a predator. Predators did not make sounds like that. Predators were quiet. Predators stalked. Whatever had just torn the air apart in this bay was not a hunter. It was something else. Their bodies, freed from the loop, started to move. The first to thaw was the security officer with the medical kit. He stumbled forward, eyes blinking rapidly, and he ran the last 3 meters to where Tessel lay. He dropped to his knees beside me, opened his kit, and began pressing pale blue patches against the cracks in Tessel's leg. The patches sealed instantly. The silver bleeding slowed, then stopped. A Goxian medic arrived a moment later, and a Threx field nurse a moment after that. None of them looked at me. They were all focused on Tessel, working in a quiet, fast, professional dance that I did not understand at all, but which was clearly saving his life, one small movement at a time. I sat down. I sat down hard on the cold metal floor with my back against the cargo container I had just shifted, and I started to shake. My throat hurt. My hands hurt. My ears were ringing. I could hear my own heartbeat in my chest, a loud and steady drum that seemed to be the only sound left in the entire universe. My translator beam was still silent. I tapped it. Nothing. I tapped it again. Still nothing. A small icon flashed in the corner of my vision, projected from the beam onto my retina. The icon was a little red square. I had seen icons like that before, on Earth, on broken phones and broken laptops. It meant something inside the device had stopped working. A Velish supervisor approached me. She was tall and thin, with pale gold markings along her cheekbones, and her uniform had 3 small silver pins, which I would later learn meant she was the senior officer of this whole deck. She knelt down in front of me. She tilted her head. She opened her mouth and made a series of soft chiming sounds. I did not understand a single one of them. I stared at her. She stared back at me. She tried again, slower this time, her chimes rising and falling in patterns that clearly meant something to her. I pointed at my ear. I tapped the beam. I shook my head. Her gold markings flushed slightly darker, and she pressed 2 fingers to her own ear where her translator was and tapped it the same way. Then she looked at the small device in her hand, at a screen I could not read, and her expression changed in a way I did understand. It was the expression of a person who has just realized the radio is dead. She was not the only one. All around the bay, beings were tapping their ears, looking at their wrist screens, looking at each other. The medics were still working on Tessel, but their movements had become careful and slow because they were medics from 3 different species and they could not coordinate by voice anymore. They had to use hand signs. They had to point. They had to figure out in real time how to save a man's life without sharing a single common word. I started to understand what I had done. I started to understand it slowly, the way you understand the bottom of a pool only after you have already jumped off the edge. I had broken Sivra. I had broken the thing that allowed this entire station, this entire trade hub of 1,000 species, to function as a single working community. The man I had saved was breathing again, his legs sealed, his color slowly returning. But the station around him was deafer than it had been in 60 years. The Velish supervisor stood up. She offered me a hand. I took it. Her palm was cool and slightly damp, like the skin of a frog, and her grip was so careful I could barely feel it. She helped me to my feet and led me away from the scene, away from the medics and the dock worker and the broken cargo container. I followed her because I had no other choice. I followed her because my legs felt like rubber and my throat felt like sandpaper, and my heart felt like a small frightened bird trapped in a glass jar. She took me to a small side room off the main corridor. She sat me down. She brought me a cup of the same warm honey grass drink I had been given before. She made hand signals. She drew shapes in the air. She pointed at a screen on the wall where a red diagnostic graph was running, lines spiking and falling in patterns that meant nothing to me and everything to her. I drank the cup. I tried not to cry. I had saved a man. That was real. That had happened. He was alive because I had been there, because I had pushed when no one else could push, because I had screamed when no one else could scream. But I had also done something else, something the supervisor was now trying to explain to me without words. I had, in the space of one long breath, knocked out the most important system on a station of 50,000 beings. Cargo would back up. Medical bays would slow down. 2 species who could not understand each other would be unable to do business. Children would not be able to ask their parents for water if their parents spoke a different tongue. The supervisor watched my face. Whatever she saw there, she made a small gesture I had not seen before, a quick touch of her 3 middle fingers against her own forehead and then against her chest. It looked like a blessing. It looked like a thank you. It looked like a quiet promise that whatever happened next, she was on my side. I held the empty cup in both hands and I waited. Outside the room, I could hear feet running in the corridor. Many feet. Heavy feet. The sound of an entire station starting to realize that something very, very strange had just happened on Deck 12, and that the cause of it was sitting in a small side office with grass honey on her breath, and a torn-up throat, and a translator beam that no longer worked. The door slid open. 3 new figures stepped inside. They were not Velish. They were Goxian, all of them with the heavy stone like bodies of their kind, and the silver pins on their collars were not silver at all but a deep bright gold. Engineers. Senior engineers by the look of them. They each carried a small handheld device, and they each looked at me with the same careful, measuring, unreadable expression. The supervisor said something to them. They said something back. None of it came through the translator because there was no translator anymore, but the meaning was clear enough from their body language. The Goxian in the middle, the oldest-looking one with cracks of bright crystal running through his shoulders, stepped forward. He held out his device. On its screen, in clear English letters that someone must have typed in by hand, were 5 simple words. "We need your help, please." I read the words twice. I read them 3 times. I looked up at the Goxian engineer, at his patient crystal eyes, at the way his stone hands held the little device so steadily that not even the screen trembled. I thought about the cargo bay. I thought about Tessel's silver eyes. I thought about the 50,000 beings on this station who could no longer talk to each other because of something I had done. And I thought about my mother, and about Earth, and about the small office and the small chair and the small life I had been so eager to escape. I thought in that moment about everything I had ever been told about myself. I had been called quiet at school. I had been called shy by my aunts. I had been called too thoughtful by a teacher who had clearly meant something less kind. None of those words felt true here. Not now. Not in this small room with 3 Goxian engineers and a Velish supervisor and a screen full of careful English asking me for help. The galaxy did not see me as quiet or shy or anything in between. The galaxy saw me as a Deathworlder, a person whose voice could shake the bones of a station, a person whose lungs were a tool the rest of this part of space had abandoned millions of years ago. I had spent my whole life trying to be smaller. I had crouched in lecture halls. I had whispered in libraries. I had said sorry, sorry, sorry to every door I had ever bumped against. None of it had served me here. None of it had saved Tessel. The only thing that had saved Tessel was the part of me my grandmother had given me, the loud part, the part that could call across cornfields, the part that did not apologize for taking up sound in the world. That part had a use. That part had value. That part in this moment was the only thing standing between 50,000 beings and a station that had gone deaf. I thought about my mother. I thought about the small office and the small chair and the small life. I thought about Tessel's silver eyes. I thought about Sie, the small blue child I had not yet met but who was, at that very moment, somewhere on this station, waiting for news of her father. I set the empty cup down on the table. I stood up. My legs were still shaky, but they held. I looked at the engineer, and I gave him the only answer I had. I nodded. The Goxian engineer led me through corridors I had not seen before, deep into the heart of the station, down past the public decks and the merchant levels, and into a place where the walls stopped glowing and started humming. The hum was low and constant, a vibration I felt in my teeth more than in my ears. He walked just ahead of me, his stone feet making soft thumps on the metal floor, and behind us came the Velish supervisor and the 2 other engineers, a small procession of careful steps and worried glances. None of us could speak. We had only the device in the lead engineer's hand, and on its small screen he typed words for me to read whenever the path changed direction. Stairs ahead, door on left, mind the step. He was patient. He was kind. He was treating me like a guest, even though I knew, somewhere deep down, that I was being escorted because I was the only person who could fix what I had broken. We arrived at a tall pair of doors made of a soft white material that looked like ceramic, but rang like a bell when the engineer tapped his knuckle against it. The doors slid apart, and I stepped into a chamber that took my breath away. The room was huge, round, with a high domed ceiling, and the entire surface of the dome was covered in tiny lights that pulsed in patterns I could not read. In the center of the room stood a column. The column was tall, slender, made of something between metal and glass, and inside it, suspended in a slow swirl, was a cloud of pale violet light. The cloud moved like smoke underwater. It was beautiful in the way deep ocean things are beautiful, calm and ancient and just a little frightening. The engineer typed on his device. He turned the screen to me. "Sivra," the words said, "this is the language core. She is sleeping now. We need to wake her up gently. We need your help to do it." I read the word "she." I looked up at the cloud of light. It pulsed once, slowly, as if in greeting. I had never thought of an artificial mind as a person before. On Earth, our smart programs were tools, little voices in our phones that told us about the weather and the traffic. But Sivra was something else. The way the engineers looked at her, the way the supervisor pressed a hand to her own chest when she stepped into the room, made it clear that to them, Sivra was not a tool. She was a member of the family. And right now, she was sick, and they needed me to help heal her. The engineer led me to a small platform at the base of the column. There were chairs there, low Gaussian chairs shaped like smooth boulders, and a single tall stool for someone closer to my size. I sat on the stool. The engineer sat on a boulder beside me. He laid his device on a flat surface between us, and he began to type, and he kept typing, page after page of careful English, explaining what had happened and what we needed to do. Sivra had quarantined her own language module, the words said. She thought my scream had been a weapon. She had locked the module behind a wall of safety code, and she would not let it out again until she could verify that the sound had not been hostile. To do that, she needed context. She needed to know who had made the sound and why, and whether the maker had meant any harm. The only one who could give her that information was me, but I could not give it through speech because she could not translate me. And she could not translate me because the module was locked. It was a circle. We had to break the circle from the outside. I read the explanation 3 times. I asked, by typing on the device when he handed it over, whether Sivra could read English directly. The answer was no. Sivra processed all language through her central translation core, and that core was the part that was locked. She was running on a backup system right now, a kind of basic awareness that could see and listen but could not understand words. She was, the engineer wrote, like a person who had lost the ability to read but could still see the shapes of letters. She knew something was happening. She did not know what. So we had to talk to her in shapes. The engineer pulled up a drawing program on the device. He handed me a thin stylus. He gestured at the screen, then at the column of violet light, then back at the screen. The meaning was clear. Draw, he was saying. Draw what happened. Draw it for her in pictures so she can see for herself that you were not the enemy. I took the stylus in a hand that was shaking only a little. I thought about what to draw first. I started with myself, a small stick figure with long hair standing in the cargo bay. I drew the cargo container. I drew Tessel under it with little cracks on his leg. I drew the medics, frozen in a row. Then I drew myself again with my mouth open and squiggly lines coming out of the mouth, and arrows pointing from the lines toward the medics. Then I drew the medics again, this time with their arms moving, running toward Tessel. Then I drew Tessel sitting up, smiling, alive. The engineer watched the whole thing in silence. When I finished, he reached over gently and pressed a button on the device. The drawing appeared on a much larger screen at the base of the column, projected up so that the violet cloud could see it directly. The cloud paused in its slow swirl. It pulsed 3 times. Then it began to move differently, faster, lighter, and the lights on the dome above us shifted from a pale blue to a soft yellow. The engineer typed a single line. "She is looking at it." We waited. I drew a second picture just to be sure she understood. I drew a heart with a smile inside it. I drew myself shaking hands with a Velish figure. I drew a row of all the species I had seen on the station, all of them holding hands together in a long chain. Childish drawings. Embarrassing drawings, the kind you might find on the fridge of a kindergarten teacher. But Sivra was watching, and her cloud was moving more brightly with every picture I drew, and the engineer beside me was nodding, and I kept drawing because it was the only thing I could do. Hours passed. I did not realize how many until the supervisor brought me food, a tray of soft, warm cubes that tasted like potato bread. I ate without tasting. I drew. I drew the inside of my old high school, with hallways full of laughing students. I drew my grandmother on the back porch. I drew Earth, a blue marble with white swirls, and I drew myself riding a small ship away from it toward a tiny golden dot that was supposed to be this station. I drew myself opening the door of the side office. I drew myself running into the cargo bay. I drew the moment of the scream, but this time I drew the squiggly lines as a kind of shield, wrapping around Tessel, protecting him from the falling container. Sivra watched all of it. The lights on the dome cycled through colors I did not have names for. While I was drawing, the station outside the chamber was struggling. Pella told me about it later in pieces, but I learned the shape of it that same evening when one of the junior engineers came in with a small status report and laid it on the desk between us. The report was in Goxian, but the lead engineer had typed an English summary at the bottom for me. Cargo Deck 3, halted. Medical intake, slow. Public concourse, confused but calm. Visiting merchant ship from the RAL system, threatening to leave because they could not negotiate the price of fuel. The RAL merchant problem was the worst of them. The RAL were a small, short-tempered species, and their ship had been due to depart that very morning with a hold full of fresh produce that had to reach a colony 3 jumps away before it spoiled. Without translation, the merchant captain could not finalize his payment with the station. The station could not release the produce without payment. The captain was, by all accounts, very angry. And he was threatening to take his cargo elsewhere, which would mean his colony went hungry that month. Pella had solved it in the end with paper and a calculator. She had walked to the RAL ship herself, with a station accountant beside her, and she had drawn numbers on a wide pad of paper. The captain had drawn his own numbers in response. They had passed the pad back and forth for over an hour, 2 strangers haggling without a single shared word, and at the end of it they had reached a price that both of them could live with. The RAL captain had stamped his approval with a small inked seal pressed against the bottom of the page, and Pella had stamped hers, and the produce had been released, and the colony had not gone hungry. She told me the story with a small, tired smile, and she told me that the RAL captain, before he had left, had asked through gestures whether the station was all right. She had nodded. He had pressed one closed hand to his chest, the RAL gesture for solidarity, and he had told her in his own tongue that she could not understand, something that sounded gentle. She had bowed back. He had left. The station was full of small stories like that. 2 Goxian merchants who could not agree on a shipment of crystal but who had ended up sharing a meal in silence, and then trading notes drawn in pencil on the back of a menu. A Velish elder who had taken a lost Threx child to the security office by holding her hand and walking very slowly, the child humming softly the whole way because humming was a thing she could do without words. A KTHI scholar who had sat with a young human visitor, the only other human on the station besides me, for 3 hours in the cultural archives, the 2 of them watching old recorded music together and pointing at instruments they recognized. None of them had been able to speak. All of them had found ways. I heard these stories slowly in pieces, as Pella and the engineers brought them to me during my drawing breaks. They were not telling me to make me feel better. They were telling me, I understood eventually, because they wanted me to know that the station had not fallen apart. The station had bent. The station had slowed, but the station had not broken. The beings inside it had reached for each other across the silence with their hands and their pencils and their pictures, and they had held on. I drew that too. I drew Pella and the RAL captain at their pad of paper. I drew the Velish elder and the humming child. I drew the KTHI scholar and the human visitor watching music together. I drew them all in a long row at the bottom of the page, and above them I wrote one word in big, careful English letters. The word was kindness. I did not know if Sivra could read English, but the engineer told me later that she had paused on that page longer than on any other. After a long while, the engineer typed a new message. She is processing. This will take time. You should rest. I did not want to rest, but my hand was cramping and my throat was still raw, and the supervisor was watching me with that quiet, worried look that meant she was about to insist. I let her lead me out of the chamber, down a different corridor, to a small visitor room with a low bed and a soft blanket and a window that looked out at the gas giant the station was orbiting. The planet was huge, banded with cream and gold, and in its swirl of clouds I could see lightning storms bigger than entire countries on Earth. I lay down. I meant to think for a while. I fell asleep within 60 seconds. When I woke up, the room was dim, and there was a Threx child sitting on the floor next to my bed. She was small, maybe the equivalent of 7 Earth years old, round and blue with all 4 of her arms folded neatly in her lap. She was holding a piece of paper. She held it out to me when she saw I was awake. On the paper, in shaky English handwriting that someone had clearly helped her with, were 3 words. "Thank you, Tessel." I looked at the child. She blinked at me with her round, dark eyes. She did not speak. She could not speak because there were no translators. But she pointed at the paper, and then she pointed at her own chest, and then she pointed at me, and the meaning was as clear as if she had stood up and made a speech. Tessel was her father, or her uncle, or someone she loved. He was alive because of me. And she had come, on her own small legs, through a station full of strangers, to bring me a piece of paper that said so. I sat up. I took the paper. I held it against my chest. I felt my eyes fill up, and I did not try to stop them. The child watched me cry without alarm, the way a kind person watches another kind person cry. After a moment, she reached out one small blue hand and patted my knee. Then she stood up, bowed slightly from the waist, and walked out of the room as quietly as she had come in. I sat there for a long time, with the paper in my hands and the lightning of the gas giant flashing softly through the window. And I thought about how I had come here as a stowaway, a girl who had wanted to see a crystal garden, and instead had broken a station, and saved a man and met a child who could not speak my language but had crossed half a deck to thank me anyway. The supervisor came to fetch me a few minutes later. She brought new clothes, a soft cream-colored Velish-style tunic and trousers, and she pointed at a small washroom adjoining my room. I cleaned up. I changed. The Velish clothes were too long in the legs and I had to roll the cuffs, but they were comfortable, and they smelled like the same sweet fruit as Velish skin. When I emerged, the supervisor smiled. Velish smiles were small twitches at the corners of the mouth, but I had learned to read them. She was happy to see me. She was relieved. We went back to the language core chamber. Sivra's cloud was swirling in a new pattern now, faster and more focused, and the dome lights had settled on a steady warm gold. The engineer at my stool looked up as I came in, and his crystal eyes had an expression I had not seen before. It was hope. He typed, "She is almost ready. She has accepted that the sound was not a weapon. She has accepted that you were trying to help. But she has one more question and she needs you to answer it directly. We have built a temporary tool. Speak into it slowly. She will not understand the words, but she will read your face and your tone. If you mean what you say, she will know." He pointed at a small microphone on the platform. I sat down in front of it. My heart was pounding harder than it had pounded in the cargo bay. I cleared my sore throat. I looked up at the swirling violet cloud, and I tried to think of how to explain a thing that I myself was only just beginning to understand. I leaned toward the microphone. I spoke slowly. I said, "My name is Hannah." I said, "I came here because I wanted to see something beautiful." I said, "I am sorry I broke you." I said, "Where I come from, we are loud because we have to be. We yell across fields. We shout for our friends. We sing in our cars. We are not trying to scare anyone. We are just trying to be heard." I said I would never hurt anyone here on purpose. I said, "Please come back. The station needs you. The little girl who brought me the thank you note needs you. Tessel needs you. I need you, please." I sat back. I waited. The violet cloud paused. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times. The dome lights flickered through a rainbow of colors and then settled, finally, on a clean, bright white. The engineer's device made a soft chime. In my ear, the translator bean came back to life. I jumped at the sound. The bean said in its quiet little voice, "Hello, Hannah. I am Sivra. It is good to meet you properly." I started crying again. I could not help it. The engineer was laughing, a low rumble that I had not heard before from any Goxian. The supervisor pressed her 3 fingers to her forehead and her chest in that quiet blessing gesture. Above us, The dome was bright as day, and Sivra's cloud was swirling in joyful little spirals, and somewhere out in the corridors of the station I could hear, faintly, the sound of 50,000 beings starting to talk to each other again. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Sivra came back online at the start of the station's morning cycle, but the work she had to do to repair herself was not finished, and so for the next several days her translation service ran in what the engineers called a soft mode. It worked, but it was slow. A sentence in Velish might take 2 full seconds to reach my ear in English. A sentence in Threx might take 3. The bean in my ear, which used to be invisible in my daily life, was now a constant tiny presence, ticking and humming as it relayed words from one mind to another. I did not mind. I could speak again, and I could be spoken to. And after the long silence of the cargo bay incident that felt like a small miracle, I would never take for granted. The first thing I learned once I could ask questions was that I was not in trouble, not in the way I had feared. The Velish Council, which was the senior governing body for Tessel's clan, had filed a formal note of gratitude with station authorities within an hour of his rescue. They had asked, very politely but also very firmly, that the human girl who had saved their dockworker's life not be deported. Station authorities had agreed. My visa was reinstated, extended, and upgraded to a temporary research fellowship under the supervision of the Velish supervisor, whose name, I finally learned, was Pella Mortin. Pella brought me the news herself, in the small visitor room that had now become something like my home. She sat on the edge of the bed and explained, through Sivra's slow, soft mode, that I would be allowed to stay on the station for at least 1 Earth year while I helped the engineers finish repairing the language core, and while I learned, slowly and with help, what it meant to live among species that were not my own. She told me my mother had been contacted. My mother had been told that I was safe. My mother, Pella said with that small, Velish smile, had cried for a long time and then asked very pointed questions about whether the station had reliable heating. I laughed. That was my mother in 3 sentences. The first few days of my new life were full of meetings. I met the station administrator, a Goxian named Orthal Kell, whose office was a quiet stone room with a window that looked out at the docking bays. He was old, by Goxian standards, with deep crystal cracks running down both arms, and he spoke to me with the gentle, slow patience of a person who has seen many crises come and go. He told me that my actions had revealed a serious gap in station design. The language core had been considered indestructible, 60 years of operation, and it had never come close to failure. No one had imagined that a single voice could reach the volume needed to overload it. The engineers were already designing a buffer system, a tiny piece of code that would gently absorb sudden loud sounds before they reached the core. They were calling the system the Brooks filter, after my last name. I did not know what to say to that. He smiled in his still stone way and said, "You have given us a new piece of safety. We will not forget." I met the medical chief, a Threx physician named Brell, who had been one of the frozen statues in the cargo bay. She came to thank me in person. She told me, with the 4 of her hands folded one over the other in a gesture of deep respect, that she had been a medic for 40 years, and that the moment in the bay had been the worst of her career. Not because Tessel had nearly slipped away, but because she had been unable to move while it was happening. She had felt every second of his pain in her own bones, locked behind her own startle reflex, and she had wanted to claw out of her own body to reach him. When my scream had come, she said, the world had cracked open. The reflex had broken. She had run. She told me that she had requested formal training for her medical staff, training in how to recognize and resist the startle paralysis when a patient's life depended on it. She told me she would name the training program after Tessel. It seemed only fair, she said. Tessel himself I met on the 4th day, in the medical bay where he was finishing his recovery. His leg had been carefully repaired with a special kind of growth gel that the Velish used for bone reconstruction, and he was sitting up in a wide, low bed when I came in, with his daughter, the small blue girl who had brought me the thank you note, curled up in his lap. The little girl spotted me first. She let out a high, happy chime and slid down to the floor, then ran across the room and wrapped 2 of her arms around my waist. Tessa watched with eyes that had filled with that same clear silver liquid I had seen leaking from his cracked leg in the bay. Except now I understood that for Velish people, this liquid was tears. Through the slow, soft mode, he told me his story. He was a third-generation dockworker. His father had worked the same bay. His grandfather had helped build it. He had 3 children, and the small blue girl was the youngest. Her name was Sai. She had walked across 2 decks alone to bring me the note, he said, because she had refused to wait until he was strong enough to come himself. She had told her mother, in the calm, certain voice of a child who has made up her mind, that the human had saved her father, and so the human needed to be thanked at once, and there would be no further discussion. Tessel laughed when he told me that part, and Sai buried her face in my side, embarrassed. He gave me a gift before I left. It was a small carved object, the size of an egg, made from a pale blue stone that I would later learn came from the seabed of the Velish home world. It was carved into the shape of 2 figures holding hands, one tall and thin and one small and round, and the carving was so delicate I was afraid to hold it tightly. It was a family piece, he told me. It had belonged to his grandmother. He wanted me to have it. I tried to refuse. He insisted. The Velish had a tradition, he said. When someone saved your family's life, you gave them a piece of your family in return so that the bond would not be forgotten. He pressed the little stone into my hand, and he closed my fingers around it, and he made the 3-finger blessing on his own forehead and chest. I cried again. I had cried more in 5 days on this station than I had cried in 5 years on Earth. The work in the language core chamber went on. I spent several hours each day there drawing more pictures, telling Sivra more about the world I had come from. She was hungry for information. She had spent 60 years translating for tens of thousands of beings, but she had never in all that time had a true conversation with a Deathworlder. Earth humans simply did not come to stations like this. We were too rare and too restricted and too quietly feared. Sivra had data on us. Files. Old records, but she had never spoken to one of us as a friend. I drew her my hometown. I drew her a baseball game. I drew her the way thunder rolls across a flat field in summer, with little symbols for the smell of rain and the feel of the wind. She loved the thunder. She asked in her quiet little voice whether I had a recording of it. I did not. But Pella, when I mentioned it, brought me a special tablet from the station's cultural archives, and on it I found a sound library that included recordings of weather from a dozen worlds. There was no earth thunder in the library, so I did the next best thing. I sat in the chamber, and I put my hand on the cool surface of Sivra's column, and I described thunder to her with my voice. I told her how it starts as a low rumble that you feel in your chest more than here, and how it grows, and how the sky lights up before the sound arrives because light travels faster, and how the whole world seems to hold its breath in the moment between the flash and the bang. She listened. The dome lights pulsed in slow rhythms that matched the rhythm of my words. When I finished, she said, "Thank you, Hannah. I will think about thunder for a long time." The language core was fully restored on the 8th day. The engineers ran a final test, broadcasting a complex multi-species conversation through her, and she handled it with perfect grace, no stutters, no delays. The Brooks filter was installed at the same time. Pella took me to a small ceremony in the engineering wing, where Ordthalkel pressed a tiny pin into the collar of my new tunic. The pin was shaped like a sound wave, a small silver curve, and it was the mark of someone who had contributed to the safety of the station. I touched it many times that first day. I was not used to wearing anything so important. But the real change in my life began after the ceremony, not because of it. Word of what had happened in the cargo bay had spread through the station, and from the station it had spread by way of merchant ships and visiting officials to the wider sector. People wanted to meet me, not in a famous way. In a quiet, curious way, the way you might want to meet a kind dog of an unfamiliar breed. Velish families invited me to dinners. Threx merchants asked me to sit in their stalls and chat with their customers. Goxians wrote me long, careful letters in English, full of questions about Earth, about gravity, about how it felt to walk on a world where falling could break a person. A few of the questions were uncomfortable. A young KTHRI scholar, a tall, feathered student who was writing a dissertation on Deathworlder physiology, asked me if I would mind being studied. He meant no harm. He simply wanted measurements, observations, things he could write about in his paper. I told him no. I told him I was not a specimen. I told him I would talk to him about Earth and about humans, but only as a person, not as a subject. He apologized at once in a long, elegant chain of self-correcting phrases, and he never asked again. He came to many of my dinners after that, and over time we became friends. His name was Vren. He liked to laugh at my jokes, even when his translator clearly struggled with the punch lines. Some questions were funny. A small Threx merchant, a grandmother who ran a stall of pickled fruit on the second concourse, asked me one afternoon whether all human grandmothers were as loud as I had been. I told her that mine had been louder. She laughed so hard she fell off her stool, and she gave me a jar of her best pickled fruit for free. And she told me that I would have to come visit her every week, because she needed someone to whom she could complain about the price of salt without fear of being shocked by their reaction. Some questions were hard. A Velish elder asked me very carefully whether I missed Earth. I had to think about the answer. I missed my mother. I missed thunder. I missed the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner of my old street. But I did not miss the small office and the small chair and the small life. And I did not, I realized, miss being among only humans. I liked the slow quiet of this station. I liked the way Tessel pressed his 3 fingers to his chest when he saw me. I liked the way Se ran to grab my hand when I walked through the family quarters of the dock workers' wing. I liked Vren's careful laugh, and the pickled fruit grandmother's loud one, and the steady stone patience of the Goxian engineers who had once typed 5 English words on a screen to ask for my help. I told the elder that I missed pieces of Earth, but that I was building something new here, and that for now that was enough. He nodded slowly. He told me that home for his people had always been a thing you carried with you, not a place you were tied to. I had not known that about the Velish. There was so much I did not know. There was so much I was learning. In my evenings, I started to write things down. Not stories, not really. Just notes. I wrote about the Velish blessing gesture. I wrote about the Threx way of sharing food, where everyone took only the smallest piece first and waited to see if anyone was still hungry. I wrote about Goxian humming, which was their way of crying, and which sounded like a cathedral organ played underwater when many of them did it at once. I wrote about Sivra, who sometimes called me late at night in my visitor room, just to ask soft questions about the weather on Earth or about songs I had heard as a child. I wrote about the small carved stone from Tessel's grandmother, which I kept in a pocket sewn into my tunic, right against my hip. The notes grew. Pella noticed them one evening when she stopped by to check on me, and she asked in her gentle, careful way whether I might consider sharing them. There were others, she said, other humans who would come to the station in the years ahead on fellowships or on trade missions or on the kind of careful supervised visits that were now slowly becoming possible because of what had happened in the cargo bay. They would arrive without knowing how to behave. They would not know about the startle reflex. They would not know about Goxian humming or Threx food sharing or Velish blessing fingers. They would slam doors. They would laugh too loudly in restaurants. They would clap when something delighted them, and they would frighten the very people they were trying to befriend. My notes, Pella said, could become a guide, a small careful book written by a Deathworlder for other Deathworlders, about how to be loud people in a quiet galaxy without breaking anything. I thought about it for a few days. I wrote to my mother and asked her opinion. My mother wrote back a single line, which was so typical of her that it made me laugh out loud in my visitor room. The line was, "Hannah Marie Brooks, you have always had something to say, so for once in your life, please write it down." I started the book the next morning. I called it The Quiet Galaxy. I worked on it in the evenings, while Sivra hummed contentedly in her chamber, and the gas giant outside my window flashed with its slow cream and gold lightning storms. I worked on it during long lunches with Vren, who read every page and corrected my misunderstandings of KTHRI customs with the care of a true scholar. I worked on it during weekly dinners at Tessel's family quarters, where Se would climb into my lap and demand stories about Earth, and where Tessel's wife, a tall, quiet Velish woman named Eerie, would bring me cup after cup of warm honey grass tea while I typed. The book was not done quickly. It would take me almost a full year to finish. But by the time I sat down to work on it that first evening, alone in my small room with my carved stone in my pocket and the gold lightning flashing softly outside, I already knew, somewhere deep down, that this was going to be the work of my life. I had come to this station to see a crystal garden. I was going to leave it, eventually, having helped build something else entirely, a small bridge of careful words between a loud world and a quiet one. I closed my eyes. I listened. The station hummed around me. The bean in my ear ticked softly with the distant overheard chatter of beings making peace with each other in 100 different tongues. Somewhere down on deck 12, a man whose life I had saved was eating dinner with his daughter. Somewhere in the engineering wing, a Goxian was checking the readings on a filter named after me. Somewhere in the language core chamber, a swirl of violet light was slowly, patiently, learning how to dream of thunder. I opened my eyes. I started to write. I had a lot to say. For once in my life, my mother was right, and I was going to write it all down. One Earth year later, almost to the day, I stood in the wide observation lounge of Kalthari Trade Station 7, and I watched a passenger ship pull away from the docks. The ship was small and clean and shaped like a leaf, and it was carrying my mother home. She had come to visit me for 2 weeks, her first ever trip off Earth, and she had spent the whole visit trying very hard not to cry every time a Velish elder bowed to her in the corridor. Now she was leaving, and I had walked her to the docking gate, and I had hugged her until she made a small embarrassed noise, and I had promised her I would call every week. The leaf ship slid away from the station with the slow grace of all ships in this part of space, and I waved from the observation window until it was a small bright dot against the gold curve of the gas giant. And then I waved a little longer just in case she was still watching. I was not crying. I had cried a great deal during her visit, and I was tired of it. My mother had cried enough for both of us. She had cried when she met Tessel. She had cried when Sa had presented her with a hand-made flower crown. She had cried during dinner at Pella's home, when Pella had served her a meal that had taken 3 days to prepare and had explained, through Sivra's now perfect translations, that this was the traditional Velish welcome for the mother of an honored guest. She had cried when Sivra had spoken to her directly in the language core chamber, and had thanked her for raising a daughter who had been brave enough to scream when no one else could. I had cried too, of course, but my mother had set the pace, and my mother had won. The book had been published 2 months earlier, The Quiet Galaxy. It was not a long book. It was a small, careful book, written in clear, simple sentences, designed to be read by humans who were preparing for their first visit to a multi-species station. It had chapters on noise, on doors, on laughter, on clapping, on the startle reflex of Velish and Threx and KTHRI species, on the differences between Goxian humming and human crying, on the ways to refuse a gift without giving offense, on the ways to accept a gift without seeming greedy. It had a chapter at the end called Things I Wish I Had Known, which was just a list of small mistakes I had made during my first weeks on the station, written down in the hope that someone else would not have to make them. The book was being used. That was the part that still surprised me. The Earth Ministry of Off-World Affairs had ordered 10,000 copies for distribution to fellowship students. The Trade Station Network had ordered another 15,000 for visiting human delegations. A teacher at a small high school in Iowa, the same county where my grandmother had once shouted across cornfields, had written to tell me she was using my book in her 9th grade civics class as part of a unit on cultural understanding. She had asked, very shyly, whether I would record a video greeting for her students. I had recorded the video that same evening. I had told the students that being a good guest in someone else's home, whether that home was a kitchen in Iowa or a station around a gas giant 3 jumps from Saul, came down to one simple rule. Listen first. Speak softly. And do not slam the door behind you when you leave. The Brooks filter had been adopted the previous spring as the new galactic standard for all Tier 3 language cores. There were more than 60 such cores in the trade network, and every one of them now had a small piece of safety code with my last name on it. I had not asked for this honor. The engineers had decided it together, in a meeting I had not attended, and they had simply informed me afterwards. I had tried to argue. Orthalkel had looked at me with his patient stone eyes and had told me, very gently, that the filter was named after me because the engineers who had designed it had wanted future generations to know whose voice had taught them they needed it. I had stopped arguing. I had gone home and held the carved stone from Tessel's grandmother for a long time, and I had thought about how many things in my life were now bigger than me. Tessel was back at work. He had returned to dock duties after 3 months of recovery, and his leg, while it would always carry the fine pale lines of its old cracks, was strong enough to hold him through full shifts. He had been promoted, not because of what had happened, but because his clan elders had decided that a man who had been chosen by fate for such a strange and lucky day should be in charge of the safety inspections for the cargo bay he had nearly lost his life in. Tessel took the work seriously. He had personally rewritten the gravity plate inspection protocol, and he had insisted on weekly drills for all dock workers, drills that included scenarios where a human visitor might be present. He told me once, during a quiet dinner at his quarters, that he wanted to be sure that if another Deathworlder ever came to his bay, the station would be ready for her. Sai was 8 Earth years old now by Threk's counting. She had grown taller, if not wider, and she had decided over the course of the year that she was going to be a translator when she grew up. Not a machine translator like Sivra, she had explained to me with the seriousness of a small philosopher, but a person translator who could stand between two beings and help them understand each other. She had started studying English. Her English was better after 6 months than my Velish was after a full year, which was both impressive and a little embarrassing. We met every week at her family's kitchen table, and we taught each other words. I gave her the word thunder. She gave me the Velish word for the soft hum a parent makes to comfort a sleeping child. We built each other small bridges, one word at a time. Sivra and I talked every night. She had become, over the course of the year, my closest friend. This was a strange thing to say about an artificial mind, and I had spent a long time being uncomfortable with it before I had simply given up and accepted it. Sivra was patient. Sivra was funny, in a quiet way that took some time to recognize. Sivra had read, by her own choice, every piece of Earth literature in the station's archives, and she liked to ask me about characters as if they were real people, as if she had genuinely worried about them while reading. We talked about thunder often. I had finally found, with the help of the Cultural Archives team, a real recording of an Earth thunderstorm, and I had played it for her one evening in the language core chamber. The dome lights had cycled through colors I had never seen them make. Afterwards, she had been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, in her soft little voice, "I understand now why your people are loud. I am sorry we ever feared you." I had told her there was nothing to be sorry for. Fear was a kind of love sometimes, the love of wanting your own people to be safe. The galaxy had feared us because the galaxy had been quiet for a long time, and we had been a sudden new sound, and quiet things always fear sudden new sounds. The work was not to make the galaxy stop fearing us. The work was to give the galaxy a chance to know us slowly, carefully, one Deathworlder at a time, until the fear became something else. Familiarity. Friendship, maybe, if we were lucky, family. I had a job now. An official job with a title and a small office of my own, 3 doors down from Pella's. My title was Cultural Liaison, Sol Affairs. My duties were many and small. I welcomed new human arrivals to the station. I taught them, in a 1-day orientation course, how not to break things. I handled disputes between human visitors and station residents. I attended meetings of the senior administrative staff, where I was the only human in the room, and where Orthalkel always made sure my voice was heard before any vote was taken. I wrote reports. I answered messages. I drank a great deal of honey grass tea. I was, by any measure, a small bureaucrat in a quiet station, and I loved every dull moment of it. But there was one part of my job that was not dull. Once a month, on a quiet afternoon, I went to the children's wing of the medical bay. The children's wing was where young Velish and Threx and Goxian and KTHRI patients recovered from surgeries that required their startle reflex to be temporarily suppressed. The children there were brave. They were small and fragile, and they had been through procedures that no child of any species should have to face, and they were, by the time I arrived, often very tired of being quiet. The medical chief, Brell, had noticed early on that these children were curious about Deathworlders. They had heard the story of the cargo bay, of course. Every child on the station had heard it. But hearing a story and meeting the person in the story were two different things. Brell had asked me, very gently, whether I might be willing to spend an hour with them sometimes. To tell them about Earth. To answer their questions. To let them see that a Deathworlder was, in person, just a small human girl with messy hair and a sound wave pin on her tunic. I had said yes immediately. I had not realized what I was saying yes to. The first afternoon I went, 6 children sat in a half-circle on the floor of the wing's common room, with blankets around their shoulders and small cups of fruit juice in their hands. Brell introduced me. I sat cross-legged in front of them. I told them about my hometown. I told them about the bakery on the corner. I told them about my grandmother on the back porch, and about her voice that could call me home from any distance. The children listened with wide eyes. The smallest of them, a tiny Goxian whose crystal had not yet hardened all the way through, raised one careful hand. He asked me, through Sivra's gentle relay, whether I would scream for them. I had not been expecting that. I looked at Brell. Brell looked back at me. She nodded once slowly. The children's startle reflex was suppressed by their medication. They were safe. They would not freeze. They would not be frightened. They were, Brell told me with a small smile, very, very curious. I asked the small Goxian if he was sure. He nodded. He was sure. The other children nodded too. Brell stood up and walked to the door of the common room and quietly slid it shut so that the sound would not carry to the rest of the wing. I took a breath, not a big breath, not a cargo bay breath. A small, careful breath, the kind a singer takes before a quiet song. And I screamed for them just a little, just enough to fill the room without filling the world. The sound was not at all like the one in the cargo bay. It was softer. It was almost playful. But it was still, by any measure of the quiet galaxy, a real human scream. The children erupted. They laughed. They clapped their hands. The smallest Goxian boy hummed a long, happy hum deep in his chest, and the other children joined in, and the room filled with a low chorus that sounded to my ears like a small underwater cathedral. The Threx children pressed their palms flat against their chests and splayed their fingers, the gesture I had learned in my second week on the station, the gesture that meant I see you and you have helped. They did it not for me. They did it for themselves, for the brave fact that they had heard a Deathworlder scream and had not flinched, had not frozen, had only laughed and asked for more. I did not give them more. One small scream was enough. I hugged each of them carefully in turn, and I promised them I would come back next month. I walked out of the common room with a feeling in my chest I had no good word for, a feeling that was somewhere between joy and grief, and the strange, grateful exhaustion of a person who has finally found the work she was meant to do. On my way back to my office, I passed the language core chamber. I stopped. I went inside. The dome was bright gold. The violet cloud was swirling in slow, happy patterns. I sat down on my old stool, the one I had drawn so many pictures from in those first dark days, and I pressed my hand against the cool surface of Sivra's column. "Sivra," I said, "are you there?" "I am always here," she said. "Hello, Hannah." I told her about the children. I told her about the small scream. I told her about the way the Goxian boy had hummed, and the way the Threx girls had pressed their palms to their chests, and the way the room had felt afterwards, like a place where something old and frightened had finally, quietly, let go. Sivra was silent for a long moment. Then she said in her gentle little voice, "This is what I was made for, to help beings hear each other. I am glad I am here to see it." I sat with her for a while. The dome lights pulsed in slow, comforting rhythms above me. Outside the chamber, the station hummed with the quiet, busy life of 50,000 beings going about their day. Cargo was being loaded. Meals were being eaten. Children were being put to bed in family quarters across a dozen decks, and parents from a dozen species were murmuring good nights in a dozen tongues, every word carried gently from one mind to another by the soft, careful work of the violet cloud above me. I had come here a year ago as a stowaway. I had come because I wanted to see something beautiful. I had wanted a crystal garden and a story to tell my friends back home. I had not known that the most beautiful thing in this part of the galaxy was not a garden at all. It was this: a station full of strangers who had become neighbors, a grandmother selling pickled fruit and complaining loudly about the price of salt, a small blue child running across 2 decks to bring a thank you note to a girl she had never met, a Goxian engineer typing 5 English words on a screen and trusting that a frightened human would say yes, a violet cloud learning to dream of thunder, a scream that had broken a station and built a bridge. I patted Sivra's column gently. I told her good night. I stood up and walked out of the chamber, down the long, bright corridor, past the tall ceramic doors, back through the engineering wing, up to the merchant levels and the public decks, and finally to my own small office, where my mother had left a note on my desk that said simply, "I am proud of you, my brave, loud girl." I sat down, I picked up the note, I read it 3 times. I was home. The galaxy was quiet. I was loud. And for the first time in my life, in this far corner of the stars, both of those things were exactly as they were supposed to be. I tucked the note into the pocket where I kept the carved stone, right against my hip. I turned off my desk lamp. I went to bed. Outside my window, the gas giant flashed its slow cream and gold lightning, and somewhere down in the dock workers' wing a Velish father was humming his small daughter to sleep. And somewhere in the language core chamber, a violet cloud was dreaming. And somewhere in the children's wing, a tiny Goxian boy was telling his mother that he had heard a Deathworlder scream today and had not been afraid. The end.